There are crimes so refined, so meticulously planned, that they look more like operas than felonies. This is one of them. February 1995. A cold morning in St. Petersburg. Inside the grand, icy silence of the Russian State Historical Archive, a senior archivist pulls open a cabinet like she's done 1,000 times before. Only this time, her fingers freeze mid-air. The folders are there. The files aren't. Gone. Dozens. No signs of forced entry, no alarms, no broken glass. Just emptiness. What was missing? Not war secrets, not intelligence reports, love letters, postcards, stamps, ink, envelopes with royal seals from the 1800s. Items that, to the untrained eye, look like the relics of sentimentality. But to those in the know, to collectors, they are gold. Literal millions. Detective Sergei Kuvakin, a quiet man with eyes like frost and a love for Russian history, is assigned the case. He walks into the archive and, within minutes, sees what no one else did. The letters were still there, but the envelopes, the ones bearing the stamps, the seals, the postmarks, those were gone. The thieves weren't after words. They were after proof, philatelic treasure, the kind of paper that can outprice diamonds on the black market. Kuvakin starts close. He checks antique dealers, secondhand bookstores, collector clubs. It doesn't take long. He finds a man who's been quietly offering up envelopes, specifically with the rare Schlüsselburg postmarks. But when police search his home, there's not a single stamp in sight. Instead, they find something else. A handwritten decree, dated 18th century, signed, in ink, by Empress Elizabeth of Russia. That stops Kuvakin cold. Only one place in the country houses documents like that. This archive. He rushes back to confirm it. The archive staff recognize it immediately. It belongs to the Imperial Collection, a sealed vault containing orders, correspondence, and official decrees, all with original signatures from the Tsars themselves, from Anna Ioannovna to Nicholas II. Irreplaceable, untouchable, until now. Then the true horror surfaces. When they audit the imperial vaults, more than 4,500 rare documents are gone. Not dozens, thousands. Auction experts estimate the total loss at $24 million, or nearly 100 billion rubles at the time. But there's a bigger problem. No forced entry, no broken cases, no fingerprints, no timeline. Kuvakin faces two grim possibilities. Either it's an inside job by trusted archivists, or the workmen, those fixing the roof, installing the wiring, found a way in. But no suspects emerge. No one looks guilty. No one talks. And yet, whoever did this knew exactly where to go. These weren't random grabs. Documents were carefully removed, folder by folder, some even surgically cut from bindings with precision tools. Others, torn out with brute force, like a burglar smashing stained glass with a rock. Two styles, two methods, two personalities, a professional and a savage. That could only mean one thing. There wasn't just one thief. There was a team, a leader, someone who knew the map, and helpers, newbies, reckless, loud. Even worse, this job had to take days, not hours, and certainly not a rushed midnight heist. These documents were deep inside the archive, accessible only under tight security and only by day. But you can't browse 200-year-old royal decrees in a lunch break, which meant someone had full access. At night, with keys, with codes. But there was a problem with that theory too. The archive had military-level security, an alarm system, manned guards, entry logs, locked gates. So how the hell did they do it? Kuvakin hits a wall. Weeks go by. He alerts customs posts, sends bulletins to Sheremetyevo, Pulkovo Airport, and the city's seaports. Border agents are instructed to screen anything that looks like it belongs in a museum. He sends a global alert through Interpol, Christie's, Sotheby's, dealers in Geneva, London, New York. Any trace of the loot? Nothing. And then, months later, May 22nd, 1995, a letter arrives from Berlin. It's from a man named Mecklenburg, the owner of a rare manuscript store in Germany. He explains casually that in March, a Russian man brought in 14 autographs from Russian emperors, looking to sell. The names, the handwriting, the seals, all match what Kuvakin is missing. Attached to the letter, photocopies of the documents. It's them. They request the name of the seller. When the reply comes back, the room goes silent. Vladimir Feinberg. That name doesn't just ring a bell. It detonates one. Because 10 years earlier, Feinberg was convicted for stealing, you guessed it, documents from this exact same archive. And not just that. He also robbed a wealthy private collector's home in the 80s. 6 years in prison. But here's the kicker. He was out in 3. Kuvakin finds out Feinberg still lives in St. Petersburg, but the man is like smoke. Surveillance fails. He's nowhere and everywhere at once. But then comes a breakthrough. German consulate records reveal someone had invited Feinberg to Berlin. A photojournalist named Helen Darban. A foreigner, accredited, clean, maybe too clean. Could she be his mule? They watch her. Nothing. Not a single meetup. Still, when she flies back to Berlin, German police raid her apartment. Inside one of her travel bags, untouched in a closet, are over 200 stolen imperial documents. Priceless. Signed by Russian monarchs. Later valued at $3 million. She claims Feinberg left the bag. She never looked inside. Just doing a favor. Maybe she was innocent. Maybe not. Doesn't matter. The trail is hot now. June 7th. Kuvakin and his team raid Feinberg's apartment. And it's not an apartment. It's a museum. An unholy temple of stolen beauty. The walls are lined with oil paintings, antique maps, imperial portraits, Romanov-era books, and hundreds of rare documents. It's as if the Hermitage and the State Archive had a bastard child and left it in this Soviet flat. And sitting in the middle of it all is Feinberg. He plays it cool, shrugs, smiles, claims he bought everything fair and square. Someone sold it to him. He won't say who. Later that night, the police arrest his supposed partner, a small-time businessman named Alexander Zaitsev. Then they pick up a third man, Alexander Bezopasnosti, junior sergeant, guard, and employee of the very police unit that protected the archive. The story that follows is straight out of a Cold War thriller, but it's all real. Shall I continue with part 2? The deeper detectives dig, the more absurd it sounds. But absurd doesn't mean untrue. In Russia, especially the Russia of the 90s, absurd was normal. Bezopasnosti, the junior officer tasked with protecting the archive, confesses first. Not because he broke, but because the whole thing started with an accident. One night on duty, bored and half asleep, he opened the old cast-iron stove next to the guard post. Inside, stuffed haphazardly, he found a modern-looking folder. Curiosity piqued, he took it home. Didn't even know what it was. Just a folder. Inside, documents. Old, fancy, with signatures. Days later, flipping through a local classifieds paper, he stumbled across an ad. Buying rare stamps, postcards, documents, good prices. The address? A tiny shop on Nekrasov Street. Owner? Vladimir Feinberg. When Feinberg saw the contents of the folder, he reportedly went pale. Trembling hands, wild eyes. The kind of look a starving man gives a feast. But it wasn't just the contents that excited him. It was the source. When Bezopasnosti casually mentioned he worked in the very building where the folder came from, the Russian State Historical Archive, Feinberg knew fate had just handed him the keys to the kingdom. He paid the guard 70,000 rubles on the spot and made a promise. "Help me get more," he said, "and by New Year's, you'll have a 3-room apartment." It was an offer too sweet to resist. And Bezopasnosti, a low-paid officer with no prospects, gave in. In June 1994, the operation began. It was simple, almost elegant. On the nights Bezopasnosti was assigned to a specific post inside the archive, he'd call Feinberg with a single message: "I'm in." Around midnight, Feinberg and Zaitsev would arrive. Bezopasnosti would disable the alarm, open the door, and vanish into the background. Feinberg, having memorized the archive's floor plans from his days as a fake journalist, moved like a surgeon through the vaults. He knew which collections held value, which boxes to open, which folders to target. By morning, they'd have filled 2 large bags: postcards, letters, royal decrees, imperial records, priceless artifacts of Russian history stuffed like laundry into duffel bags. At 5 a.m., they'd signal the guard who'd reactivate the alarm, open the gate, and send them back into the sleeping city. 4 times they repeated this process. Once, they brought 2 new men, amateurs, hired muscle. That explained why some folders were found mutilated, pages ripped out, bindings destroyed. The precision had vanished. The looters had grown careless, or greedy. Still, when the investigators confronted Feinberg, he held his ground. "I bought everything," he insisted, "from that man." He pointed to Bezopasnosti. Same with Zaitsev. "I'm just a businessman. He brought the documents. I helped resell." It was a neat legal trick, and not easily disproven. In fact, the only other person who might have confirmed the full scope of the conspiracy was the getaway driver. The man who picked up Feinberg and Zaitsev at dawn, night after night. But when brought to testify, he recanted. Suddenly had no memory, no dates, no names, just fog. And then, the twist no one saw coming. March 25th, 1996. Feinberg, the mastermind of one of Russia's greatest archival thefts, is released on bail. Let that sink in. He stole over $24 million in national treasures. Evidence was found in his apartment. Documents had been smuggled abroad. German authorities had verified his direct involvement. And yet, he walks. 50 million rubles. That's all it took. Even Zaitsev, his partner, was released earlier, on account of health reasons. By summer, the guard, Bezopasnosti, is out too. And then, Feinberg disappears. Gone. Like ink fading from a century-old letter. No one knows how, no one knows where. He simply vanishes, as if swallowed by the very past he plundered. The man who stole history becomes history. But the story doesn't end there. Let's go back to the very beginning. Leningrad. A little boy is taken on a school trip to the Hermitage. His name? Vladimir Feinberg. The boy is entranced. Paintings, statues, velvet ropes, gold-leafed frames, Tsarist jewels. The sheer weight of centuries. He doesn't want to leave. By the time he's a teenager, he's collecting stamps, then postcards, then old photographs. By college, his collection is already impressive. But Feinberg doesn't want impressive. He wants legendary. He learns about the State Archive and its reading room. Anyone can visit, if they're a recognized specialist. But Feinberg isn't, so he fakes it. In the early 80s, his cousin, a real journalist in Moscow, works for a cultural magazine. One day, Feinberg visits and steals several pre-signed official letterheads from his cousin's desk. A few days later, a special correspondent from the magazine Theater walks into the reading room in St. Petersburg. His name is Vladimir Feinberg. The ruse works. He comes every day, drinks tea with the staff, charms the secretaries, learns who's who, and more importantly, what's where. In those weeks, he doesn't just read letters. He creates detailed lists of the most valuable documents. Which folder, which shelf, which room, and more crucially, the layout of the building, where the cameras are, where the guards rotate. Then he graduates to crime. May 1986. Feinberg and a friend pose as maintenance workers and scout the home of a wealthy collector named Landsman. A week later, while the man is at his dacha, they break in through the fire escape. Over 100 antique pieces vanish. He gets caught. Archive officials notice documents disappearing, And the dates match Feinberg's reading room visits. A search of his home reveals both the archive material and Landsman's treasures. 6 years in prison, but he's out in 3. This time, the world has changed. The Soviet Union is collapsing. Private trade is flourishing. And Feinberg opens a corner stall in an antique shop, Nekrasov Street. He sells drawings, letters, stamps, engravings. Business is good. One day in 1992, a man named Alexander Zaitsev walks in, a grocer, low-level entrepreneur. They hit it off. Zaitsev supplies the cash. Feinberg supplies the culture. They start a business. Faza, food and fine art, the perfect laundering front. Enter Bezopasnosti, a bored young officer, a folder in a stove, a single decision that turns him from a guard into an accomplice to the greatest cultural theft in post-Soviet history. Together, the 3 orchestrate a crime so slow, so methodical, that it evades detection for nearly a year. They rob not just a building, but a nation's memory. And when they're caught, they walk, at least at first. By 1998, the justice system catches up. The court finally sentences Bezopasnosti to 9 years. Zaitsev gets 11, and both are ordered to repay $18 million to the state. It's a cruel irony. Locked behind bars, they're expected to repay millions. As if 2 men in 2 prison bunks will generate the GDP of a corporation. Feinberg, still missing. Interpol, silent. No sightings, no auctions, no interviews. But some experts whisper, if you look close enough, if you study certain collections in Berlin or Vienna or London, you'll find traces. A seal here, a handwriting match there, a signature in iron gall ink, too fresh for coincidence. And they all bear the invisible fingerprints of a man who believed that beauty belonged not in vaults, but in his living room. There's something twistedly poetic about Vladimir Feinberg. He wasn't just a thief. He was a connoisseur, a curator, a man who didn't steal for money, not really. He stole because beauty, in his mind, didn't belong behind glass. It belonged to him. But poetic or not, the law eventually caught up. And when it did, it revealed just how bizarre this entire saga really was. After Feinberg's disappearance in 1996, things turned quiet. Too quiet. The archive beefed up its security. Customs tightened procedures. Auction houses remained on high alert. The Russian government, embarrassed by the scale of the theft, issued stern memos and moved on. But the documents, those sacred pieces of imperial history, were still out there. Collectors whispered about them in code. Museum insiders made offhand comments over drinks. And every so often, a piece would surface. Not publicly, not under glass, but in a private collection. Off the books. Off the grid. Meanwhile, Zaitsev and Bezopasnosti were stuck in their new reality. Prison. The sentences were harsh. 11 years for Zaitsev, 9 for Bezopasnosti, but not unexpected. What was unexpected was the court's decision to demand restitution. Together, the men were ordered to repay $18 million to the State Historical Archive. That's $9 million each. In rubles, unthinkable. The courtroom didn't blink, as if prison inmates had the means to generate corporate-level revenue from behind bars. And yet, this absurdity was part of the story all along. Absurdity wasn't a bug. It was a feature. Back outside the prison gates, detectives pieced together the remnants of Feinberg's criminal empire. They found more documents, stashed in random places, inside walls, at hospitals, in the attic of Zaitsev's sister's apartment. One folder had been hidden behind medical files in a storage closet at her clinic. Another was tucked between plumbing pipes. It was like playing cultural whack-a-mole. For every document they recovered, another went missing. For every bag retrieved, a new name surfaced. And always, Feinberg's name lingered like cigar smoke in a locked room. By now, the full scope of his operation was clearer. This wasn't a heist. It was a campaign. Feinberg had built his life around one central obsession: to own the greatest private archive of Russian imperial history the world had ever seen. Not to sell it, not to display it, to have it. His apartment wasn't just a stash house, it was a temple, carefully organized, categorized, every signature under plastic, every stamp labeled, no chaos, no mess. A part of him wanted to get caught, maybe, but a bigger part of him wanted to be remembered. What made Feinberg truly dangerous wasn't greed, it was vision. He had spent decades watching collectors buy back their own history at auctions in Europe. He saw Russians pay top dollar for portraits of Romanovs in Paris or for icons smuggled into Geneva. And somewhere along the way, he must have thought, why not cut out the middleman? Why not just take it? In the post-Soviet chaos of the 90s, he wasn't alone in that thinking. But few dared target the past itself. Most looted factories. He looted time. There's a reason archivists feared him. Not just for what he did, but for how he did it. Because Feinberg understood the system better than the system did. He didn't hack security, he charmed it. He didn't sneak past guards, he recruited them. He didn't break into vaults, he walked through the front door. Think about that. The most valuable historical documents in the country, stolen not by a spy with gadgets, but by a middle-aged man in a trench coat, sipping tea in the break room. In a different life, he could have run a museum. In this one, he dismantled one, piece by piece. By the early 2000s, whispers of Feinberg's whereabouts began surfacing. A sighting in Vienna, a private sale in Prague, a name on a passenger list headed to Buenos Aires, but nothing concrete. No arrests, no photos, no fingerprints. Interpol kept his name on the red notice list. Russian authorities claimed they were pursuing leads. But behind the scenes, even they weren't sure they wanted him found. Because here's the dirty secret. For every document Feinberg stole, he preserved it. Meticulously, painstakingly, almost lovingly. Some were returned in better condition than when they left the archive. There are rumors, just rumors, that certain institutions, short on funds, quietly accepted offers to borrow their own documents back from anonymous private collectors. Some say those collectors were proxies, others say one man pulled the strings. A man who once dreamed of living in a museum and ended up building one, in exile. Of course, none of that absolves what he did. He robbed a nation of its memory. He turned public heritage into personal property. He betrayed trust, corrupted officers, and turned a pillar of Russian culture into a crime scene. But here's the part that keeps historians up at night. We don't know what we've lost. Because the archive never had a complete digital inventory, no full backups, no photographs of every document. For many of the items Feinberg took, we only know they existed because they are gone. The man didn't just steal history, he erased pieces of it. And the worst part? We'll probably never know how much. In some parallel life, Vladimir Feinberg is sipping espresso in a Paris cafe, reading about a museum auction, smiling to himself. Somewhere, in some private villa, a sealed cabinet holds documents bearing the signatures of emperors. Nicholas I, Alexander III, Catherine the Great. They sit in silence, not in glass cases, not behind alarms, but in velvet folders, waiting. Because Feinberg's genius wasn't just the theft, it was the patience, the long game. He knew the real value of history isn't in today's price, but in tomorrow's desperation. And he was betting that one day, someone would want it badly enough to buy it back. In every photo from the investigation, he looks the same. Composed, clean-shaven, sharply dressed. If you didn't know better, you'd think he was the investigator, or the professor, or the head of the archive itself. But behind that politeness was calculation. He used charm the way others used crowbars. Even his business partnership with Zaitsev wasn't random. Zaitsev ran a grocery trade. Steady cash, untraceable transactions, and more importantly, an excuse to rent commercial space, to receive parcels, to quietly inventory history without raising suspicion. The documents, when they arrived, weren't stashed in bags under beds. They were filed, protected, cataloged, cross-referenced. Feinberg had systems. He had folders, plastic sleeves, acid-free paper. His apartment was a living, breathing shadow archive. Some say he treated the items better than the state ever did, and that's where the moral lines start to blur. Because in Russia, the past has always been political. And yet, in the Feinberg case, it became personal. He wasn't stealing to destroy. He was stealing to preserve. Just not for everyone. Only for himself. There's a moment in his first recorded police interview that never made the news. When asked why he took the Empress Elizabeth decree, the one that tipped off the entire investigation, Feinberg reportedly smiled and said, "It didn't belong in a drawer." Imagine that. 4,500 priceless artifacts taken, and he still thought of himself as a custodian. But then again, isn't that how all great thieves think? They don't break rules. They correct mistakes. They don't steal. They liberate. And for a while, Feinberg had the system fooled. Even after his arrest, even with evidence piled around him like bricks, he kept the story simple. He didn't steal anything. He bought it. And who could prove otherwise? Without security footage, without signed confessions, without timestamps, it became a case of implication, not confirmation, which made his release on bail all the more infuriating. And then he vanished, not fled, vanished. No flights, no cars, no witnesses, just a quiet apartment, an unanswered summons, and a man-shaped void in the fabric of Russian law enforcement. Was he smuggled out? Did someone tip him off? Some say he had contacts in customs. Others point to his connection with foreign journalists. But the truth is likely simpler. Feinberg had planned for escape the same way he'd planned for theft. With quiet, invisible precision. He had funds. He had friends. He had fakes. And more importantly, he had leverage. Because here's the darker side of this story, the one no one at the time wanted to say out loud. Feinberg still had documents. He never gave up the full collection, not even close. And those documents were insurance, a get-out-of-jail-free card printed on 200-year-old paper. It's believed that before his arrest, Feinberg arranged for certain folders to be shipped abroad, not for sale, but for safekeeping. Quiet storage units in Germany, Switzerland, maybe even Israel, all under assumed names, all off the books. That's why no major museum ever announced receiving the stolen pieces. Why auction houses never reported mysterious drops. Feinberg wasn't just hoarding history, he was hiding it. And if he was caught again, all he had to do was whisper a name, point to a storage unit, mention a buyer's name, and the whole game would reset. It's hard to know exactly how many people helped him. Some did so knowingly. Others perhaps believed they were part of a legitimate trade. A collector in Munich, a courier in Warsaw, a warehouse clerk in Antwerp. Feinberg built his network like a spider builds a web, quietly, with patience, thread by thread. But every web has its weakness. And Feinberg's, for all its genius, was rooted in obsession. That obsession left fingerprints. It made him arrogant, made him talk too much, brag too softly, smile too knowingly at auctions. It's said he once held a private showing in Prague, a backroom exhibition for a handful of elite clients. No cameras, no bidding, just viewing. One of the guests, a former museum director, later described the experience as the most disturbing moment of my professional life, because he recognized the documents, not by name, but by feel. Paper that should have never left Russia. Paper that once sat in royal hands. Paper that now sat under lamplight, in a room that stank of perfume and crime. But even he couldn't prove it. Because Feinberg was careful. No watermarks, no record numbers, no public trace, just ink and power. The kind of power only history can give you. Because in the end, That's what this story is really about. Not stamps, not postcards, not even money. It's about control. Feinberg didn't want to own the past. He wanted to rewrite it, page by page, signature by signature. And for a moment, just a brief, glimmering moment, he did. One man, one obsession, one archive, gone. You know how some people dream of fame or fortune or power? Vladimir Feinberg dreamed of footnotes, of being the invisible hand in the margins of history books. The name no one says aloud, but every scholar whispers. He didn't want headlines. He wanted legacy. And that's what makes him more dangerous than any jewel thief or art forger, because this wasn't about the money. It was about reverence. He wasn't just stealing from a nation. He was placing himself beside its emperors, page by page. The case files are closed now, officially. What could be investigated was. What could be prosecuted was. But what was recovered? That's another story. To this day, more than 3,000 documents remain missing. That's not speculation. That's from the archive's own revised logs. But how many were never logged to begin with? That's a question no one in the archive can answer. Because this wasn't just theft. It was also exposure. Feinberg didn't just rob Russia's past. He revealed how fragile that past really was. No backups, no high-resolution scans, no serial numbers, just folders, cabinets, old locks, and older habits. The illusion of order in a country still reeling from collapse. And Feinberg? He walked straight through it. The worst part is, he might not be done. You see, there's something else that surfaced. Something never released publicly. A customs log from 1996, uncovered years later in a declassified intelligence archive. It lists a diplomatic pouch, unscanned, unsigned, leaving Moscow bound for Brussels. The recipient was a cultural attaché with ties to a now-defunct trade mission. The contents? Unlisted. But the timing? 3 days after Feinberg's bail release. 1 week before he vanished. Coincidence? Some say yes. Others know better. It's widely believed that Feinberg orchestrated a final shipment, one last score, using the very tools of the state to smuggle out what he couldn't carry. And from there, he disappeared into the European ether, a ghost with a private museum in his luggage. He may still be alive. He'd be 70 now, well-dressed, quiet, sharp, the kind of man who doesn't draw attention unless he wants to. There's a theory, just a theory, that he operates under a new name, one that appears every so often in rare book fairs. A discreet buyer, never photographed, always pays in cash, travels light, never lingers. It's hard to verify, because even his enemies can't help but respect the elegance of his operation. The officers who caught him still speak with grudging admiration. The archive director, now retired, once admitted off camera. He saw the cracks we never knew existed and walked right through them. But admiration doesn't erase damage. What Feinberg took wasn't just old paper, it was context. A letter from Tsar Nicholas to his interior minister, gone. A decree from Catherine the Great abolishing tariffs in Crimea, missing. Correspondence between imperial governors and the palace during war, vanished. These aren't just documents, they're threads in the historical fabric. When you pull them out, you don't just lose facts, you lose stories, motives, decisions, and eventually, truth. And Feinberg knew that. That's why he took them, to possess the unpossessable, and maybe to rewrite his own story along the way. The irony? For all his intelligence, all his precision, all his mythology, he remains a footnote. In Russia, the Feinberg case is rarely taught, rarely mentioned. You won't find documentaries, no museum plaques, no true crime bestsellers, just silence, a gaping wound where a lesson should be. But those who remember, remember everything. Detective Sergei Kuvakin, the one who saw through the missing envelopes, who connected the first dot. He never stopped searching, even after the case went quiet. He retired a few years later, having solved the biggest cultural theft in Russian history. He keeps a photo of the recovered Empress Elizabeth decree in his office, laminated, framed. When asked why he didn't keep a photo of Feinberg instead, he smiled and said, "Because that would have been his trophy, not mine." Zaitsev and Bezopasnosti both served most of their sentences. Upon release, they faded into obscurity. Rumors say Zaitsev now works in logistics. Bezopasnosti applied to be a security guard again. He was denied. As for Helen Darbin, the German photojournalist whose bag carried $3 million worth of Tsarist documents, she was never formally charged. No evidence of intent, no proof of conspiracy. She claims she never opened the bag. And maybe that's true. Maybe, like the rest of us, she was just another bystander, standing too close to genius and madness colliding. So where does that leave us? With a case still open in the minds of historians, with an unknown number of relics scattered across Europe, with a man who rewrote the rules and then vanished between the lines. And maybe, just maybe, watching this video now, someone out there recognizes something. A name, a date, a document framed in their grandfather's study. If so, here's what you need to know. History doesn't disappear. It just waits. Buried in basements, shelved in silence, passed from one hand to another until someone asks the right question at the wrong time. And Vladimir Feinberg? He was the man who made sure we'd keep asking. Whether you call him a thief, a genius, a criminal, or a collector, one thing is certain. He didn't just steal the past. He made himself part of it. The end.